Hi, I'm Jim Providenza. This is the Santa Cruz Northern Railroad. I'm glad you're here. We're going to spend some time going over this creation, and we're going to look at some of the ideas and some of the processes, look at some of the tricks and tips of things that the layout that's at this point pretty close to 35 years old, and still, thank God, has got some sort of a currency. People seem to like it, and it has remained pretty much close to the state of the art in terms of layout design. It was designed back in the mid-'80s as an operating railroad, and it has always been an operating railroad. People ask me, well, what do you do when we're not operating? It doesn't run. It's here for you as an operator to come to an operating session and make this thing run like a real railroad. As we spend some time together, we're going to talk about, or I guess I'm going to talk about, some of the key concepts and where the key influences were. The original design and concept was to showcase as many different types of trains as possible in an operating session. So there would be a unit train, there might be fast freights, there's passenger train locals, because when we think of operations, too often we think of just switching cars, and yet if you're a helper engineer on a helper, you have, on a long train, you have some serious work to do. I'm really fortunate that by the time I was designing this, there were two key resources available, and one was John Armstrong's Track Planning for Realistic Operations. It's in its third or fourth edition. At this point, it certainly could use a new edition. The other one was Alan McClellan's V&O story, and that was actually in process as I built the first version of the Santa Cruz Northern. His concepts of operating a railroad, moving beyond the basement, being part of the national network, and all of the interchange and things that develop out of that were key to the sort of things that we're going to see as we take a tour of the railroad. We'll start off today by watching the westbound perishable. It runs over the entire railroad, starts out actually in Stockton, way off the model portion of this railroad, on the Western Pacific. It also joins with the Santa Fe there in Stockton, and it pulls cars from both of those. And then it runs over the Western Pacific to San Jose, where we pick it up. It joins the Santa Cruz Northern. So a little bit of the backstory about the railroad is that this is basically the route of the Southern Pacific over the Santa Cruz Mountains. So Santa Cruz Northern, why now? Well, in 1940, the Southern Pacific had the opportunity to get rid of the railroad. Big storm, and it wasn't that much damage, but they didn't want the railroad anymore. And World War II was coming, and they managed to take out a whole chunk of railroad that wasn't needed for the war effort. In my freelanced version of reality, the Western Pacific and the Santa Fe were able to purchase the railroad. Not that the SP really wanted that to happen, but the war effort required it. Move ahead, a generation and a half, 2 generations. Here we are in 1971. The Santa Cruz Northern is this jointly owned subsidiary. So we see some Western Pacific power, occasionally some Santa Fe power, cabooses from both of those railroads, and then we'll see Santa Cruz Northern power, which for some reason has a lot of Alcos in it. The concepts of the proto-freelanced railroad, go back, at least coining the term, I think was Tony Custer. And, he is currently, his Trains of Thought column really is a serious examination of where our heads can really be in terms of what we're looking at for making a railroad seem to be, more than just this little, 1 to 87 model, something that really engages you. So the original concept back was this cascade of trains running over the Santa Cruz Mountains, jointly owned subsidiary. Over the years, my focus has changed slightly in that I came to realize that what we were trying to do was essentially role-playing. Okay? This is just one big role-playing game. And as I moved to different types of train dispatching, and eventually ended up with what we've had now for the last 20 years, timetable and train order operations, we have really focused on different jobs that people do and the interaction between the different jobs. So, the railroad was such that you had distributed information and distributed authority. Normal working day engineers and conductors were responsible for incredible, value to a company. And they did it without direct supervision. And unlike competitive games, working on a model railroad is a cooperative event. So we're trying to simulate how it was that real railroaders did things working together to accomplish the goal of making money for the railroad and their paychecks and going home safely. So we're going to follow that fine train. We're going to see where we go. One perishable on its way. So the perishable has come around and see the tail end going into Mack Street Yard, and you notice that my aisleways in spots are too narrow. If you look at this, it's a nice 33-inch curve out here, but it's a 21-inch radius curve on the inside there. The curves are too tight. I've got some long sidings, but for my taste, they're way too short. Compromises that you have to make when you're designing things. And you end up pushing the limits with longer cars, not as long as you might want. And you have issues with curvature, S-curves, the sort of motive power that you can use. The railroad was designed with those sorts of issues in mind. There's very few 6-axle, locomotives on this railroad. They're mostly 4-axle. And the reason is the curvature. It's a narrow gauge right-of-way with a standard gauge railroad laid on top of it. As we follow the perishable and other trains around the railroad, there's a lot of freight cars. I'm a freight car guy. we've left the lower level here on the Santa Cruz Northern. We went through, San Jose, we went through East Rica, crossed Las Gatas Creek, and we're coming up now Watson Creek Trestle. It's a herniated helix. What that means is that the lowest level of the track is actually hidden behind. It's a 30-inch radius curve. These are 32-inch radius curves. They're all stacked one on top of the other at the back. That gives me 4 inches of room here to be able to create this scene so that you can see what's actually going on. There's over 45 running feet of track in this helix, and that's an awful long time to not see your train. And it's one of the few places where we really have a lot of distance on the railroads, so it's an integral portion of it. I know for a fact it's the only thing that an original thought on my part for model railroading. Not to say that somebody else didn't think of it as well, but at least for me it was a brand new and total thought. But we're coming up now into Ilium, the top of the helix with a sand plant. Again, very much a part of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Railroading there dealt a lot with timber and lumber in a time period, and then shifted to other sorts of things like sand. You'll notice that we have a group of cars here, again that freight car guy thing, but this is a perishable, it's hot traffic. These are refrigerated cars and high value appliance cars going across the mountains to Santa Cruz. The reefers are empty at this point. They'll come back loaded from the produce area down in Watsonville and Castroville and all those wonderful areas with apples and Martinelli's apple juice and artichokes. Continuing our climb, we're now crossing Bridge 5 and actually up onto the second level of the railroad. The bridge is a lift pivot design, and we'll take a look at that once we've gotten the perishable across it. It actually was designed by Lou Steenwick for his son Mark for his beer line railroad in Kansas City, modeling the Milwaukee Roads beer line. It's a lift pivot bridge, and the way it works is that it lifts up and pivots down and drops in place. It's very simple to make. If you look at it, you see that there's drawer slides and a door hinge and a flat surface for the bridge to be on. And you put it up, you bring it down, you drop it in place. Now, there's some telltales behind me for our door into the rest of the house, and they're there for a very specific purpose because there's a step down when you walk into the garage here, and those telltales warn you, one, you're about to step down, and two, you're about to hit a bridge. We have handholds here for people to help get under it when we're actually operating, but the truth of the matter is with the design of the bridge, you can do that and hit it, and then you just have to check to make sure that it aligned itself properly, and you're still in business. We're now coming into Holy City, and it's the longest passing siding on the railroad. For those who are into timetable and train order operations, it's not a place that has an operator, so it gives a little bit of added spice to operations in that the dispatcher has to plan things a little bit ahead for his meets here. We're also at Zayante, and we're also at Santa Cruz. What we have here is the working station of Holy City on the front 3 tracks. And the back 3 tracks are the upper level staging, and they're the station of Zayante, but they also represent the end of the line at Santa Cruz. So as we continue around the railroad and get to the upper level, or as we continue on the upper level, we're going to eventually end up back over there. But in the meantime, we're up front here in 2 totally different places. So we have here some work equipment, work train. We've got some, industries. And behind that, you can see the trains that are staged that will go on to the other parts of the railroad at different times as we have an operating session. As we come out of Holy City, we're going to cross the long Bean Creek Trestle. getting us past the garage doors, basically. But then we're going to make a turn, and it's actually hidden trackage. We cross the crossing with the Fall Creek and Alba at the far end, and as the locomotives disappear to your left, they're actually making a half loop. They reappear coming back towards you on the near side and into the town of Fallon. So this is one of the hidden pieces of trackage on the railroad that allows us to have the sort of curves for a minimum radius, but still gets us the scenes that we want and some of the operational aspects with a little bit longer sidings and that sort of thing. As we're coming through Fallon here with the perishable, we're looking at the tops more or less of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Think of yourself, if you live in the area, of going over Highway 17, and you're over the summit almost, and you're starting to look at the fog bank and the clouds, the tops of the trees of the redwood forest receding into the distance. The clouds are done with stencils and some additional work with brush and a damp sponge, several different colors of paint, and the tree line is done with several different colors of green acrylics, lightened or darkened, and faded into the distance with just plain aerosol white paint. Our family has a cabin in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Up a distance from the cabin is an old redwood stump from logging back 150 years ago. And it's called the jump stump, this particular stump, because there's a ladder attached to the side of it. And as a kid, I did, and then my kids as kids would climb up the ladder and jump off the stump. And this is a scene depicting me with my young daughter about to jump off the stump, and I'll catch her, and her brother, who's 5 years older, climbing up behind her, and I'm not going to catch him. So, as we watched the perishable go past and we see the bridge in the distance and the creek coming here in the foreground, what you need to realize is that immediately behind this fascia here is the turnback curve on the other side of Fallon that we saw as the train came across Bean Creek Trestle, went through Fall Creek Junction and disappeared and then came back around. Another bit of hidden trackage is immediately to my right. These here, underneath and behind this narrow bit of landform and underneath the trackage here at Sargent's, is a loads empties hidden staging for the log train, okay, where the loads and empties are both hidden underneath and behind here and come out and make their move across the railroad in either direction and go back in the opposite way. We're coming through Laurel here, and this is a town that developed as the railroad age matured and started to tell me what really it wanted to be. Several years ago, I made a huge change on the railroad and changed the orientation of the upper level, which required changing trackage coming off the helix, and resulted in a rearrangement of most of the track at the west end here of Laurel, what is now called Laurel. And in doing so, I was following after the prototype location of Laurel on the old South Pacific coast / Southern Pacific in the Santa Cruz Mountains on the west side of the summit. We've arrived at the end of the mainline run on the Santa Cruz Northern as it exists in this environment. Arrived at Zayante, and theoretically we continue on to Santa Cruz.
Hello, I'm Paul Weiss. We're here in the Santa Cruz Northern office for the East Rica and Laurel agent operator. It's a really marvelous job here on the Santa Cruz Northern because it includes many of the fascinating facets of prototype railroading. First of all, from an agent perspective, the agent operator is responsible for what's really the customer part of the railroad operation. So customers may have empty cars that they need picked up. They may well have a request for cars that they want to receive. They may have loaded cars that they need to have picked up, and so forth and so on. So an important part of the agent job is to figure out all the needs of the customers and go looking for empties if they've requested empties, and make sure that the local, which is pending to arrive, has its instructions to do the switching in the respective towns. There's also the opportunity for this job to serve as the operator. The operator is the railroad facing side of the job and responsible for all aspects of railroad operations in town. That means trains will arrive and their OS needs to be noted for the dispatcher. The dispatcher will also call with orders that need to be copied and distributed to the trains. Here we have a train order signal board, which I can use to stop trains when orders have been issued that they need to receive. I also need to record all the movements of trains through the towns, through the paperwork that's required here of the operator. So it's a diverse job, it's busy, there's always something to do, and in between moments of busyness is the opportunity to rail fan passing trains that don't have local work here in town. Also important to note about the agent operator here at East Rica and Laurel is its location in the physical vicinity of the layout. I'm sitting now speaking to you inside a helix that allows trains to travel between the two levels. The amount of space I have here is perhaps 3 feet wide, perhaps 2 feet deep. Included in the space, though, is everything I need to do the job. You can't see, but I've got a fast clock here, which is in the fast clock network with the other clocks. I've got the train order signal panel. There's also a panel for the interchange. I have a scissor type telephone. A whole bunch of paperwork is here behind me. It's very efficient use of space, and you really can say when you're fulfilling this job that you're in the middle of everything that's happening on the railroad, including the fact that trains that are going between levels on the helix are going to come all the way around me, and I get to watch them come down while I'm fulfilling my other duties as agent operator. Now we've made the transition, and I'm sitting here at the agent operator desk at Fallon in a different part of the room. There's a little more room for us to breathe here, so let's talk a little bit about the paperwork. Here's a telephone that I can will receive calls from the dispatcher when I have to copy orders. This is a pad of train order forms, beautifully made to resemble the prototype in this tissue-like paper called flimsies. Orders are transcribed there. Other forms that we have to take a look at. This is an empty car order that I referred to earlier, and this would be a customer on the railroad that's seeking an empty car. A clearance form is issued whenever an order is issued for a train that's originating in my territory. We prepare a switch list because when the local train is coming, they're going to need to know what work is going to get done in town. And this will be a list of all the cars that are going to be spotted or pulled and reporting marks accordingly. An important part of the job is getting all this organized so no time is wasted when the local train arrives. The rack over here contains waybills, and you may be able to see there's a section for cars that are being spotted, cars that are staying in place, and cars that are being pulled. That helps organize what's going on. Each car has a waybill describing where it's off to or where it's coming from. In conclusion, the job has many facets. Paperwork is an important part of the job, but in no way does it dominate the day or the experience for the agent operator. So we're having a good time keeping things organized, but also being involved in the operations of the railroad.
The log train. Oh, it hurts. it really does. There's two trains that people can have trouble with, so to speak, on the Santa Cruz Northern. One of them is pretty well known, the Cementipede. And frankly, that's one where people can get in trouble all on their own. The log train is a slightly different proposition. The cars are cranky. Barrel Ding and Lumber Company that owns the cars has never seen fit to, maintain them properly. It's amazing the Santa Cruz Northern lets this, short line take its train over its main line, but the Santa Cruz Northern needs money. It's been in receivership for years. So what we're seeing now is the head end of the Fall Creek and Albus Power, an Alco and a Baldwin, and they're pulling the log train into Fallon, and they're not powerful enough to make it up to the summit at Sargent's, and so they're going to have to double the hill. They will cut off their power and the head 8 or 9 cars, and they will make their way up to the summit at Sargent's, cut off their train. We'll watch them as they're going through, and they are dropping those cars. They come back down, and we'll have picking up the second half of the train, hike it back up the hill, combine the two, and then head off downgrade to the Barrel Ding and Lumber Mill at Laurel. So we have picked up the rest of our cars, and we're now going to head off the summit down the hill to Laurel and Barrel Ding and Lumber. So we're winding our way back to Fallon. We have set out the loaded logs and picked up the empties. We're now coming around the curve and about to drop into town. We'll eventually run around the train and stuff it into the FCNA trackage. Pretty much it for the log train. Well, here we are at SP Crossing, where the Southern Pacific Vasona branch comes across the railroad, and the helper engine on the train that's the Cementipede is pulling the cement cars off of the SP, and when they're done, we'll couple up the power on the head end. We'll run over about 2/3 of the railroad because those cement cars have to get up here to Santa Cruz Portland Cement. It's about 40 cars switching back and forth. Drives people crazy. We've even put together PowerPoint presentations to show the easiest way to work this train, and quite often people decide they have a better way to do it, and we just sit back and watch and see what happens. the cement train has made it up the hill to Fallon, and at that point we're going to go down the dam site branch. It's just the west of the west switch of Fallon. And we're going to be handling about 30 to 40 cars, half of which are loaded with nice heavy cement. And so the head end power had to get behind the cars that they're going to push down the branch to the cement plant. They cut off, they got run around with the cars by the helper cut back off, he's going to go home. The head end power is now pushing the empty cement hoppers down to the plant. They'll connect onto the loads, pull them out, get them up to sergeants to store there while they finish their switching with the empties, and then everybody will put it all together and get back home. This is the largest industry on the Santa Cruz Northern. The job that you saw parts of ends up moving 40-something cars, up here at San Vicente on the cement plant, the dam site branch. And as it finishes up and it's a wrap, it will take the loaded cement and the empty coal cars and that they've exchanged stuff for, and take it back down the hill. The empty cement cars will go back to the SP at SP Crossing. The Santa Fe coal cars will go back to the Santa Fe in Stockton. The plant here is a combination of maybe 7 different kits and a bunch of scratch building. These are almost the exact height that they should be, and they're made out of 2.5-inch PVC pipe to come close to the size that they should be. The plant parts are from different actual cement industry plants. This is part of Monolith Cement. This is actually from New Jersey Zinc, of all places. But other parts are from the cement plant at Santa Cruz, which in my time period I call Santa Cruz Portland Cement, and you can barely see the logo back hidden behind things, as it was on the prototype. So realize that we really looked in depth at only 3 of the trains on the Santa Cruz Northern. During a regular operating session, which, depending on whether we break for lunch or not, can last between 4 and 6.5 or 7 hours. We'll run 12 to 14 trains. There'll be a dozen of us, maybe 14 people, that will, assume the roles of the train crew, the yardmaster at Mack Street, the dispatcher, as Paul Weiss described, the agent operators. So, at some point maybe we'll come back and take a little bit closer look at what an actual operating session looks like on the Santa Cruz Northern, to maybe give you a better idea of how the feel of it is and how the interaction between people. But in the meantime, just realize that overall, you're seeing what I envision a railroad in 1971 in the Santa Cruz Mountains, before Silicon Valley, when it was still the Santa Clara Valley, did, how it interacted, how its crew members interacted. That's what an operating session is really all about to me. It's we often used to say that, the trains were the actors on a stage. And I've come to the conclusion that, the operators themselves are part of those actors. The trains are still actors, but the crew members, with their various functions, whether it's an agent operator, whether it's a telegrapher, whether it's, a chief dispatcher, which you have on some railroads, are all part of this creation that we're working on. You saw a little bit of, Foreman Gonzalez with his high rail vehicle, and you saw a clip, one part of work train. And that's a regular part of an operating session. Those sorts of things happen on a real railroad. You have maintenance a way that, they call it maintenance in the way, but it has to happen on any railroad. The one thing that seems to concern people quite often is paperwork and management, and I do enough of that at work. Well, I did management and I did paperwork for most of my life. The paperwork is not onerous. It's not difficult. It adds a different dimension. Now, it's not a job you might want to do every operating session. You might only want to do it several times during a year or a couple of years. But it's another facet of the job, of the jobs on the railroad. One of the questions that I certainly have been asked any number of times, and I know a bunch of people who own operating layouts have been asked is, well, nobody who operates lives close to me. How do I find? And the answer to that is just automatically go to the OPSIG, go to the Layout Design SIG, go to the NMRA, and from there go to the Layout Design and OPSIGs. www.opsig.org. The people that are out there who are experienced at doing this are more than willing to help. Overjoyed to bring people in. Okay, whether it's designing your layout, whether it's learning how to operate. There's operating weekends that are open to anybody at various places, and you simply have to ask. And then it's a matter of finding one that's near you, finding through your NMRA division. You'll most likely be able to hook up with people. If you're not an MRA member, it's not really that expensive to join, and it really is a tremendous benefit, both to the hobby in general, but also as a conduit to get in touch with people who have a similar interest and similar desire to do these sorts of things. The biggest regret that I have, knowing that this layout design has stood the test of time for 35 years, is that the Layout Design SIG wasn't around when I designed it, because there are serious problems with staging in particular that if we had had the benefit of the Layout Design SIG at the time that I put this together, conceptually, I probably would have been able to avoid a lot of heartache along the way. I'm still very pleased with the design. It still works very well. But I tell you, there's some engineering and carpentry that I've done that to this day I still wish I hadn't had to do. In some respect, it's kind of frightening for me to realize that the Santa Cruz Northern, both in its first version that fit into a spare bedroom and in its current version in a garage, was never run on DC. I mean, that's going back 1976, 77. So originally it was GE's Aztrac and Alphatronics, and that lasted for the better part of 20 years. And in 1994, went to DCC with the lens system, an early user of that, even actually before the NMRA made a final adoption of the lens standards as theirs, or the lens patents as their standard. And then more recently, 20 years down the road, switched to NCE because lens just doesn't have the availability here in the US that it did in the past, and things moved on. The biggest thing of all of these is that having the ability to talk directly to your train, so to speak, okay, to bypass all of the stuff that we used to have to do with DC, makes operations so much more possible. You don't have to deal with all the model railroad thoughts of electrical blocks and this, that, and the other thing. And the availability to have sound in locomotives has also done a tremendous amount to improve operations from the standpoint of it makes you, or it reinforces the need to run at the speed that the sound of the locomotive tells you it should be going at. It tends to slow down things. It tends to make you think of other things that you need to do, and paying attention for blowing for grade crossings and things like that. But overall, there's been, over this last period of time, 30, 40 years, these tremendous advances we're so fortunate to have been part of. Well, thanks for joining me. I hope that over the time that we've spent together, you've gotten some idea of what it is that we try to accomplish during an operating session. If you've never been to an operating session, check around. Ask at a local hobby shop, go online to the OPSIG. The places, the people, the railroads you can operate on will be nothing but a benefit to you. You'll have a great time, I can guarantee it. And if at some point you end up here in the San Francisco Bay Area, maybe you can come operate on the Santa Cruz Northern.